This is the podcast, as you know, that starts off with discussions on Nigeria but quickly devolves into rants on racism and colonialism, even if rightly so. Welcome to 0100 Naija podcast, the Nigerian review podcast.
Firstly, we would love to apologize for the length of previous episodes.
Yes, and we just wish to offer a bit of an explanation as to why those episodes have to be as long as they were.
First and foremost, we couldn't help it. We just had to take that long.
Right, like we said before, we are just that passionate about our country and our country's history.
I think the second one was an hour long. This third one was 1 hour, 5 minutes or so.
Yeah, about that.
We tried our best to cut them short, but we couldn't help it.
Yeah, the thing is, as we go along with this podcast and with our subsequent episodes, we'll keep making references to historical events and things that happened in the colonial era and the pre-colonial period.
So it just highlights how important those episodes were.
Exactly. So if you are to keep making references to these events, it will make sense that we have already covered them in the initial episodes. So our listeners can go along with us as we continue with the subsequent episodes, of course.
As the scientists promised, we'll try our best to shorten this episode.
Right, beginning with this episode, we try to minimize the length of each episode going forward, beginning with this one, of course.
Yeah.
Right, so thank you, and please continue to be with us as we go along.
So it's Ada, your host,
and the scientists here. You're welcome as you join us on this episode 4 of our dear podcast.
It means like you just started yesterday,
right? That's 4 weeks already, right?
I'm telling you,
4 weeks of content. And thank you if you've been with us all this while. Right now, on episode 4, this is the episode where we'll be discussing the legacy of colonization. Right, on this episode, we'll be talking about the various effects of colonization on Nigerian society, most of which we could still and feel in today's society.
It's basically the impact of colonization today.
Exactly. Now, the story of British colonization of Nigeria in the first half of the 20th century leading up to independence in 1960 is a story of how they, the colonial masters, managed to unite the region that is to be Nigeria today, while still maintaining and enforcing a country divided within itself. The repercussions and reverberations of their actions, which is almost a century past, is still felt and heard all over the country today, and can be directly linked to the woes that had beheld the country all these years. In this episode, we intend to look at some of these issues of national concern and to discuss on how colonization shaped the country of Nigeria as we know it today. Right.
So we should be talking about a couple of things.
We will be discussing all this under a number of headings, including the politics and the country and national unity, and the education sector. We'll also be looking at the economy, and also finally on security and human rights. So we'll be looking at the effects of colonization on all these areas of Nigerian society. Now, beginning with politics and national unity, in the years leading up to independence, specifically 1946 to 1960, that's about the 15 years, right? Those years were occupied with the preparation of the country for self-governance. The years saw the enactment of 3 constitutions, the so-called Richards, Littleton, and Macpherson Constitution, which were enacted in, I think, 54, and 57 respectively. The constitutions were generally written and deliberated at Westminster in London, with subsequent promulgation in Nigeria. Like we touched on this in our previous episode, a constitution about Nigeria and that is to be used in Nigeria being written, deliberated in London. So these constitutions, like the colonialist policies of the British in the years prior to this, largely promoted and reinforced regional sentiments as opposed to national integration.
What do you expect?
Right? I mean, it's basically just divide and rule.
Yeah.
That was their policy, and that's what they did with these constitutions. And it's their policies generally throughout the colonial era. Right, but the constitutions alone could not be said to be responsible for this development at the time. You see, years of differential treatments and policies in the different regions had led to a gulf in the relative development of the regions, like we will see subsequently afterwards too, when we discuss the education, and also in adjustments to modern systems of government. You see, indirect rule had been more emphasized in the northern region, meaning populace there felt lesser government presence, and the traditional rulers were able to retain much of their power and influence. Indirect rule was used to a much lesser extent, however, in the south, and the populace there had more direct awareness of government presence. However, especially in the west, in the southwest that is, the traditional rulers still retained considerable influence over those years, and only in the southeast the traditional rulers have negligible influence over affairs. The reason for that is because much of that region had adopted a somewhat republican system of government for centuries prior to that. The result of all this was that in the decade, particularly in the 10 years period prior to independence, following the increased activities of local political parties all over the country, particular patterns began to develop and form, which are to become emblematic of Nigerian politics even to this day. You see, the northern political parties back then, right, especially the MPC, which is short for the Northern People's Congress, and the MPC was the dominant party in the northern region at the time, and it was almost purely and exclusively regional, right? Dealing intentionally with only regional affairs,
just
right? Regional issues, right? Now, although there were also some other political parties in the north at the time, most notably the NEPU, Northern Elements Progressive Union, that was formed and led by the late Aminu Kano. But apart from the NEPU, the other major political party was the NPC, and it was, as we said, almost purely and exclusively regional. The dominant political party in the southwest at this period was the Action Group, or AG for short. The Action Group was mostly regional, but also campaigned for national issues, including, for example, autonomy for minority groups. This was in their campaign to get support from minority groups in the Middle Belt region and in the what was to become later on the Midwest region. The other main political party in the country at the time, and perhaps the only political party which could be said to be truly national in nature, was the NCNC, short National Council of Nigeria and the Cameroons.
Cameroons, right?
Yeah, actually, prior to this time, and even as at independence, if I remember correctly, the map of Nigeria wasn't what it was today. Subsequently, shortly after that, I think in 61 or so, some parts of Cameroon, which today would be parts of the states of Borno, Adamawa, and some parts of Taraba, the easternmost parts of those states were actually used to be part of Cameroon. There, right? Cameroon has this tumultuous history over this period when these polls were taken. There were these election polls when they were trying to decide if they should be a country on their own or if they would want to be part of Nigeria. So some parts of Cameroon decided to become parts of Nigeria. So there was all that. And you see, even till today, that is still an issue that the country of Cameroon is still battling with. With the region of Ambazonia calling for secession and all that, right? So the NCNC, like we were saying before, pardon our digression, was headed by Nnamdi Azikiwe at the time. Right, in the legislative elections of 1954, the NPC won 79 out of 185 seats, with the NCNC coming second with 56 seats, and the Action Group having 27 seats. You could see how this could potentially lead to problems subsequently, right? With only one region having almost half of all the seats. And then this next part is something that has been discussed extensively over the years about how in the general elections of 1959, just before independence, 174 of a total of 312 seats, this is way more than half of the total seats, were allocated as in reserved to the northern region, right? And no matter what happens in the election, this 174 is to go to the northern region. And then subsequently in the elections, the NPC, Nigeria People's Congress, won 142 seats, all occupied with northern candidates. And you see, this particular issue resulting from this election and the subsequent elections after this resulted in a lot of turmoil in the place. And it's one of the things that people point to when they discuss the things that resulted in the country being in such a disturbing state in the years leading up to the civil war, and even immediately before that, the first coup, right, in 1966. That is 6 years prior to independence. And what you say about this is the country was very much not prepared for the independence, right? Like we will say afterwards, just next in the next session here in under education, the first universities weren't built and started until the 1950s themselves. So the class of people that were to replace the colonial officers that were leaving the country, where are they to come from? Right? We have only few people who are truly university educated then, right? At least relatively few people who were truly university educated, and all of them were educated outside, right? I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but they were few. We don't have enough people to replace the people that were leaving or to run the affairs of the country, right? And you see that most of the affairs, the traditional rulers, who are supposed to be replaced by this new crop of people, were still wielding too much influence. Like we discussed in our previous episode, they had too much power, and above too, they had been given too much power under indirect rule. And then since there wasn't a proper transitional period, right, to remove that power from them and transfer it to the new crop of civilian rulers that are to be ruling the countries, they still retain too much of the influence even after independence, and that caused many of the problems we faced afterwards, of course, and I still feel today with the problems within the regions and the rivalries we faced afterwards. Now, under education now, from the early days of British presence in the region, and indeed since the beginning of European influence in the region, missionaries had been responsible for fostering Western education. We discussed this a bit when we talked about the Portuguese in the region, right? So when they came with the missionaries initially, and missionaries had the activities and stuff before they eventually just totally forgot about that and focused solely on slave trade, right?
Exploiting us.
Right. Now, this coupled with the fact that the missionaries were refused accommodation in the largely Muslim northern region due to the bundling of Christianity with education, and the fact that the colonialists themselves were little interested in educating the local populace. We discussed about the governors general, right? Being averse to the people going to school. They didn't want
the Hong Kongers, but
that was Lugard himself.
Democracy.
That was Lugard himself. He was opposed to the people here being educated, right? And when he was transferred to Hong Kong, he was opposed to the formation of the University of Hong Kong at first, and then when they formed the university, he prevented them from teaching modern ideas. Alright, so all this resulted in the problems of all this we talked about, the missionaries fostering education mostly in the southern region, and then they being refused entry and accommodation in the north for most of this period, of course. It resulted, and the colonial masters themselves not being interested in educating the people. All that resulted in the problem of unequal manpower development in the regions, right? Now, during the colonial era in the early 20th century, the successive colonial governors general continued their policies of aversion to the local education of the populace, like we said, especially at the tertiary level now. The first universities, University College Ibadan, later to be renamed University of Ibadan, that was in 1963, That was when it was renamed, right? When it became a standalone university. At first, when it was University College, it was a college under university under London. But then in 1963, it became a standalone university also. So the first universities, the University College Ibadan and the University of Nigeria in Nsukka, which is said to be the first standalone university in Nigeria because it was established in 55, but then it started operations in 1960. So that was even before University of Ibadan became a standalone university. They weren't established until the 1950s, like we said. And then imagine you establishing the universities in the 1950s. Nsukka wasn't even operating in the 1950s. It was operating from 60, right? So we have only one university in the 50s, and then independence to be achieved in the 60s. Yes. So who is to rule the country then?
Uneducated personnel.
Just imagine. And that was what happened for the most part. Not generally true, but yeah, for the most part, because if the most educated people were the ones at the top, then we used to be left in the grassroots, right, with the people there. Of course, it will be mostly uneducated people, and I don't know if it will be fair to say they are all uneducated, but at least given the system of government that was being adopted and that had to be adopted too at that time,
the kind of education that you got.
Exactly, given the kind of education that is necessary to participate in that kind of government, they were lacking in that. So they didn't have the tools necessary to participate in that new world that is being established. Alright, we're going to the economy now. Now, it has been established time and again, I think we touched on this in our previous episode, that the amalgamation in 1914 of the northern and southern regions was done mostly out of
economic reasons.
Exactly. The amalgamation conferred some benefits in management and administration of the region, and especially in creating a large market, right? But you see, the exploitative brand of racist colonial rule, rather than develop the region further, it ended up underdeveloping it because the British had little surplus capital to reinvest compared to what they extracted from the country.
So they were extracting.
Exactly.
They're not having more.
But they are not bringing the income, what they were getting
They're not being reinvested.
It wasn't being reinvested. Exactly. Thank you. So, there was the report of sometime of, I think this was during the colonial era, early in the colonial era, of them making, say, in excess of £6 million in a year, and then sending more than a fifth of that to England. And much of what is retained here, a large percentage of that goes to paying the army that is protecting themselves. We talk about security further down later on, right? So much of what is retained is used to pay that, to protect themselves, and of course to pay themselves and the people that works for them. So little of that is being invested in developing the local economy. Little, next to nothing. Now, the focus of the economy under colonial rule was on exports and imports. You see things like the narrow gauge railways that was built around this time, connecting first Lagos to Ibadan, and then it was extended to Kano after some years. That particular railway built in this time, instead of fostering internal trade and relations, its focus was mostly on promoting export and import. So you connect Lagos to Kano, you get raw materials for Kano, transport it back to Lagos, and then you get materials from Lagos that's been imported from Lagos to Kano, right? And you see, it's narrow gauge, meaning it's not meant for
the people themselves.
Yeah, it's not meant to transport people, not primarily. It's mostly just for freight and for cargo. That's what it was meant for mostly. And because if you are to connect the whole country, you won't just connect Lagos to Kano. Those are not just the two main cities. You have multiple cities in the region for that trade. And then also subsequently, you see that little to no effort was made towards industrialization or even utilization and processing of the raw materials derived locally. Hence, even though a lot of money gets generated from the finished products derived from these materials, only a fraction of that comes back here to the country where they are derived. Now, you see, what happened there is we spoke about in the previous episode about the palm oil industry in the 19th century being worth as much as billions, over £1 billion a year. They trade, right?
Yes.
Yet, out of that, the money that's been paid, that's been derived here locally from the palm oil trade is only a little in excess of £400,000 a year.
Just 400,000 pounds
pounds a year. Yet the global trade undertaken by the British is over £1 billion a year at this particular time. What happens with this is, okay, they get the palm oil, the raw materials from here, they take it there, they process it into the various finished products, soap, lubricants for this thing, and the various other products, and then they end up making way much more than that.
And they bring little or nothing back.
Little or nothing back. And then there was no effort towards, making this thing. Not just helping us, I mean, okay, why not process some of this stuff here, right? Generate some money for the local economy here. But then nothing was done in that regard. And then you see, you will be tempted to think this only happened during the colonial era. But this is what we still find happening till today. For one, in the case of the Nigeria's crude oil, you see we are exporting presently. That's almost exclusively all we do. We export raw crude oil, and we have to import and buy back refined ones at almost 10 times or more than 10 times the price of the raw one. And then a few years back, the Ivory Coast president was making some remarks in the news. It was on the news then, talking about cocoa, right, and finished chocolate products, about how the chocolate companies in Switzerland and in Europe and in the US, they make almost 100 times what they pay when they buy the raw cocoa pods and seeds from Africa here and from Ivory Coast, particularly there. So he was particularly indignant, and he was talking about starting up companies that will refine the cocoa into finished chocolate products in the country back then. So this wasn't just it didn't just stop there. It happened, it continued to happen, and it still happens still today. And that's what we were talking about when, I think, was it in the last episode or in the episode before that, and we said, although following independence, right, we achieved independence, but the economy was still largely in the hands of the British and America, right? So I say all this that we just stated, it resulted in the local economy being largely dependent on external forces, and especially on the economies of foreign countries, the colonial masters and their friends, of course, even after independence. Similar to what's happened to following slave trade. We discussed also before that following slave trade, the economy of the region became swallowed by the global economy. We are not participating much because all we do is just provide the raw materials. We are not really participants.
And give them the sleeves.
We're only getting the drops, the raindrops, the drip of the economy is what we get in here. Yet we're providing raw material that was making the global economy possible. After all, but we aren't making anything from that, and that's still what is still happening.
All I would say that you can see why our economy is doing. It's not going anywhere.
It's not going anywhere because the truth is that no economy, right, can truly get developed by relying mostly on provision of and exportation of raw materials. There's no way you can develop by exporting raw materials alone. No, you have to export those materials into finished products, valuable products that you can sell at much more money. Right? That's the way to go. Not by selling raw materials. They are finite. They are not infinite. They'll finish and you will not make anything from them. I mean, you've been selling crude oil for how many years now? And look at, we're still here. We have friggin' poverty. There's no money in this country. And that's just the case with it.
We blame that largely on corruption.
That's a different matter entirely. Right? That's a different matter. Corruption, as has been said, you see, it's not a disease in and of itself. It is the symptom of a disease. Right? The society itself is sick, and one of the symptoms is rampant corruption. I think we'll have to discuss this subsequently in one of our episodes, like we have planned. But we just have to make that clear now. Corruption itself is not the problem; it's only a symptom of the problem, and we come to look at what that means, of course, subsequently, like we promised. Now, finally, here we'll be talking about the security and human rights, the effects of colonization on security and human rights. This has been a major issue of late, right? Both from the police and the military, but of late, especially the police, of course. But just prior to that, the military was the one that was under fire especially with the US and these foreign NGOs accusing them of not respecting human rights and stuff. And it's not just accusation; those things are actually real. We are Nigerians ourselves, and we know what we see in the streets every day. Right now,
we know the stories we hear.
Yeah, exactly. So, what we want to discuss here is the roots of that in colonization, of course. Now, you see, both the Nigerian police force and the Nigerian army trace their history back to the various constabulary forces that were created by the colonial government and the Royal Niger Company in the mid to late 19th century. Remember, we discussed the Royal Niger Company in our previous episode, of course. The purpose of the constabulary forces were to protect the Royal Niger Company and British colonial officers from military incursions and attacks by neighboring empires as well as local tribes. Following the transition to crown rule and hence colonialism proper in the early 20th century, the forces, which had by this point been incorporated into the Royal West African Frontier Force. Remember, that was the force that was started by Lugard in 1897, before the colonial rule started proper in 1900. These forces were used to subjugate and overthrow uncooperative kingdoms and societies in the region. So we have things like the Benin expedition of 1897 that we discussed about. That was in episode 2, right?
Yeah.
So there was also the
Caliphate.
Yeah, the taking over of the Borno Empire. We discussed this in was it in the second episode or the last episode?
Second.
Right. We discussed that too. And then of the Sokoto Caliphate itself, which was finalized with the Battle of Kano. If I remember correctly, that was in the year 1903 when the Sokoto Caliphate was finally subjugated. So that was what these constabulary forces, where the Nigerian police force and the Nigerian army take their roots from. That was what they were used for.
Basically, to protect the government.
To protect the colonial government, right, and subjugate the local populace.
Yeah.
Right. Now, throughout the colonial period, these forces were continually used to protect the colonial government and their interests, and this trend continued even after independence with the indigenous government, of course. With the police and other security forces operating seemingly under the policy of protecting the government and government officials against the populace, as opposed to guarding and protecting the lives and properties of all citizens regardless of standing and societal position. This and the failures of successive governments in addressing the issues has been the root of the ill bedeviling the police force and indeed Nigerian army too, right?
Yeah.
Over the years, and that has resulted in various ugly confrontations between officials of the police and the citizens, including those that resulted in last year's #EndSARS campaign and protest.
I think they just marked 1 year anniversary.
Yes, and we missed our EndSARS special. We couldn't do it because by the time we started off the podcast, it was a bit too late for that. But I promise we have that planned, and subsequently we'll be doing our own EndSARS special on this podcast. But that won't be now, that will be further on into the podcast, right? So, in conclusion, the truth is that although it might be tempting, right, to blame all our problems, all our woes on colonialism and the colonial government, it won't be totally fair. Right? We have a good share of blame when it comes to that. But the truth also is that
we're largely involved.
Exactly. Much of the problems that bedevils Nigerian society today takes its roots from what happened in the colonial era, the activities of the colonial governments, the British in Nigeria here. What happened when they were here, when they were in charge here, when they put themselves in charge, and what happened when they were leaving, the people they put in charge and how they left the country itself. And there was this quote by Robert Evans, right? We spoke about him in our initial episode that is still unreleased. So the quote was that, you see, the British they've had independence for for over 400 years. Did I say independence? They've had democracy for over 400 years prior to the colonial endeavors in Africa, right? And since they started their practice with democracy, and in modern history at least, there have been no history of coups in the British. So the point he was making was this, that the British knew at that point how to form a government that will not collapse under a few years and probably in a century. They knew what to do if they had to form that kind of government. But you see, most of the governments, most of the countries that underwent colonial rule in Africa, whether be it by the British or by other European powers, in under a few years after they achieved independence, most of them had serious issues. Some of them broke down, as many of them still suffer from civil war to this day. Some of them had civil wars back in the day and still suffer from the results of those wars to this day. Right? And so it points to show that the point he made subsequently with that was that it gets hard to not point fingers at the British and say what they did intentionally. Right? It was intentional. They did these things intentional with they, ruling by division.
Of course, they did it intentionally.
They are divide and conquer policies and stuff. So that even after they left, they were still largely in control. So yeah, we might say it's unfair to blame them, or that it's irresponsible to not take responsibility for our own failures. Yeah, we take responsibility, and God knows, subsequently on this podcast, we're going to take some more responsibility too. But the truth is, we just have to, there's enough blame to go around. And much of the ills we have in the society today, the roots were in the colonial period. Yeah, that's to be said about that. This is the third installation in this series, right? Discussing Nigerian history, and we should be rounding off this officially. I should say we are rounding off this series with this particular episode, right? Although our subsequent episode, the next episode coming out next week, of course, will be a discussion by the friends of the episode, right? Featuring the Bricksmen and co, and other guests that you'll be revealing when the episode comes out, of course. So we'll be discussing this series, the different items and ideas we discuss in this series with them, and we hope you look forward to that, and we'll be catching you when that comes out. And remember to follow us on
everything, on every platform,
on our social media platform. We are on Facebook, we are on Twitter,
on
we even have Instagram out now, although no videos. Yeah, we have it, although I've been a bit lazy on that. Although
and Snapchat and
Telegram. We have a manager now. Right?
Yeah.
We have a manager now, and we are not unveiling him yet.
Okay.
We are not unveiling him. Right, and he'll be taking care of that for us subsequently, of course. And of course. So follow us on Facebook at 0100 Naija. On Twitter, we are at 0100 _Naija. On YouTube, we are 0100 Naija also, right? Alright, and of course, this podcast is being hosted on AudioMac, and it is at 0100 Naija. Remember, 0100 Naija is spelled 01-00 Naija. That's how you go about it on all platforms.
And they're out.
Right, and the scientist is signing out to catch you on the next one. Thank you.